In November 1930, a fur trapper in northern Canada reportedly found an entire Inuit village abandoned. Food on the fires, dogs dead of starvation, graves torn open. The story has been told for nearly a century, but the more closely you look at it, the stranger it becomes, not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. November 1930. A fur trapper named Joe Labelle is making his way across the frozen tundra toward Angikuni Lake, a remote body of water in what is now Nunavut, Canada, roughly 500 miles north of Churchill, Manitoba. He has visited the small Inuit settlement near the lake before, he says. He is cold and hungry and expects to find a warm welcome. Instead, he finds silence, 6 tents, no people, pots of food hanging over long, cold fires, a child's sealskin garment being mended, needle still in the hide, and, most disturbing of all, the frozen bodies of 7 sled dogs still tethered to their posts, dead of starvation. Labelle reports what he found to the Northwest Mounted Police, and one of the strangest stories in Canadian history begins. That is the story as it was first told, in a newspaper article published November 27, 1930. 25 people, 6 tents, 1 opened grave, a few dead dogs. Strange, certainly, disturbing, if true, but small, local, human-scaled. By the time the story reached its most widely circulated version, the village had grown to 2,000 people. The graves had multiplied into an entire emptied cemetery. UFOs had been spotted in the sky. Mysterious lights had been seen by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police themselves. The question worth asking is not just what happened at Angikuni Lake. The question is how a story changes. And why? We are going to do something that most retellings of this story do not do. We are going to follow the evidence, all of it, including the evidence that challenges the legend. Because at Mistyonics, we believe the most interesting question is never, what if it's supernatural? The most interesting question is always, what actually happened? If America's unexplained mysteries keep you up at night, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Mistyonics USA so you never miss what we uncover next. Hit the like button if this story is already getting to you. Now, let's start at the beginning. Angikuni Lake, spelled Anjikuni in official records, misspelled Anjikuni in almost every paranormal account since 1959, is a real place. It sits in what is today the Kivalliq region of Nunavut, deep in the Canadian subarctic, along the Kazan River. The Inuit people of this region were nomadic or semi-nomadic, moving seasonally with the caribou herds that crossed this landscape. Small temporary camps were common. Permanent villages of hundreds or thousands of people were not. The Inuit communities of this region in 1930 lived lives defined by movement. They followed the caribou south in winter and north in summer. A camp that was alive and active in October might be entirely vacant by December, its inhabitants 50 or 100 miles away following the herd. This context matters. A trapper arriving at an Inuit camp and finding it empty was not, by itself, an unusual event. The story was published by journalist Emmett E. Kelleher on November 27, 1930. In the Danville Bee, a newspaper in Danville, Virginia, hundreds of miles from the Canadian Arctic. Kelleher had a reputation even at the time for dramatic storytelling. One of the photographs accompanying his article was later identified as an archival RCMP photograph from 1909, 2 decades old, from an entirely different location. This raises a question that has never been cleanly answered. How much of what Kelleher published was what Labelle actually reported? And how much was Kelleher being Kelleher? Within weeks of the story's publication, the RCMP launched an investigation, not into a missing village, but into the newspaper account itself. Sergeant J. Nelson, stationed in the Pass, Manitoba, spoke with traders and locals who knew the region. What he found was troubling. So Joe Labelle was a real person. That much was confirmed. But his known trapping territory was in northern Manitoba, not the distant Northwest Territories near Angikuni Lake. Nobody in the region had heard of the village or its disappearance. And the photograph Kelleher had used, Nelson traced it to a 20-year-old image from the RCMP's own archives. In January 1931, the RCMP commissioner formally concluded that the story appeared to be a sensationalized invention. For 28 years, the story disappeared, not into the Arctic, into the filing cabinets of history. No books, no articles, no references of any kind. Then, in 1959, a radio broadcaster named Frank Edwards published a book called Stranger Than Science, and the Angikuni legend was reborn, larger, stranger, and stripped of almost every caveat that the original 1930 account had contained. Frank Edwards was not a journalist in the traditional sense. He was a storyteller, a radio broadcaster who had built a following on the promise of the weird, the uncanny, and the inexplicable. His book devotes 3 pages to Angikuni Lake. He offers no sources. He misspells the lake's name, writing Anjikuni instead of Anjikuni, and that misspelling would follow the story into virtually every subsequent account. Edwards gave Anjikuni to the world, but he gave it the way a magician gives you a card, with the important parts hidden. What happened to the story between 1959 and the present day is a case study in how legends are made. In 1990, British paranormal author Nigel Blundell published The World's Greatest UFO Mysteries, and in his version, the village had grown to 1,200 people. Blundell added 3 trappers who saw a luminous, cylindrical object changing shape in the sky above the lake. He added RCMP officers who witnessed mysterious pulsating lights. None of these details appear in any record before 1990. By 2001, an internet article had pushed the village population to 2,000. The story had become an entirely different story from the one Kelleher wrote in 1930. In 2017, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police published an official statement. It reads, in part, "The disappearance in the 1930s of an Inuit village near Lake Angikuni is not true. There is no evidence to support such a story." In 1988, RCMP historian S.W. Horrall told the Australian skeptics that retired Mounties who served in the area at the time recalled nothing like the reported events. Careful searches of the files revealed no reports of strange craft, no panicked visits from Joe Labelle, and no search parties dispatched. So where does that leave us? There are actually 3 separate stories here, and it is worth keeping them apart. The first is the 1930 newspaper account, a small, internally inconsistent report written by a journalist with a known flair for drama, accompanied by a fraudulent photograph. The second is Frank Edwards' 1959 retelling, popularized, romanticized, with no sources cited. The third is everything added after 1990, UFOs, mass graves, pulsating lights, thousands of missing people, none of which has any evidentiary basis whatsoever. The UFO version of Anjikuni is fiction. The Edwards version is probably fiction. The 1930 version is uncertain. Even the original 1930 account contains problems that its defenders have never satisfactorily resolved. Skeptical investigator Brian Dunning of the Skeptoid podcast examined the Kelleher article in detail. He noted that the article describes kayaks battered by wave action, but in November in northern Canada, the lake would be frozen solid, and waves would not be an issue. He also noted that later versions describe food still cooking over a live fire, yet those same versions claim the village had been abandoned for 8 weeks. A fire does not burn unattended for 8 weeks in the Arctic. These details cannot all be true simultaneously. There is a version of the Angikuni story that is mundane and entirely plausible. In the late autumn of 1930, a small seasonal Inuit camp near Angikuni Lake was vacated, as such camps were regularly vacated when the people moved to follow the caribou. The few items left behind were not abandoned in panic. They were simply not worth carrying. Joe Labelle arrived. Did not understand what he was looking at and reported his impression to the police. Kelleher received the report, embellished it dramatically, and published it in a Virginia newspaper. The RCMP investigated, found nothing to support the dramatic version, and quietly closed the file. One detail in the Edwards version has always troubled researchers who know the region. Edwards describes the abandoned village as containing sealskin garments left behind by the departing Inuit. But the Angikuni Lake area is not seal territory. It is caribou territory. The Inuit who lived near this lake would have worked in caribou hide, not sealskin. It suggests that someone describing this scene either did not know what they were looking at or was not looking at anything at all. In 1948, 18 years after the alleged disappearance, Canadian explorer Farley Mowat traveled to Angikuni Lake. His descriptions of the lake and its surroundings are notable for what they do not contain. No mention of a ghost village, no remnants of dwellings, no disturbed graves, no physical trace of a community that had supposedly housed dozens of people less than 2 decades earlier. Mowat was a careful and observant writer. If there had been ruins or signs of prior habitation visible at the lake, he would have noted them. He noted nothing, because there was nothing to note. One of the most dramatic details in the popular version of the legend is the account of a trapper named Armand Laurent and his 2 sons. They supposedly saw a large cylindrical object in the sky that transformed into a bullet shape and flew toward Angikuni Lake. This account has been repeated as fact in dozens of books, documentaries, and websites. What those sources rarely mention is when this story first appeared in print, 1990, 60 years after the alleged event, in a UFO compendium by authors who offered no sources and no documentation. Armand Laurent's UFO was invented in 1990. It has no evidentiary basis. The Angikuni story is, in this sense, a perfect specimen of how legends are built. A kernel of something, a questionable newspaper report, a possibly confused trapper, a remote and genuinely mysterious landscape provides the seed. An author with no obligation to accuracy plants it in more fertile soil. Each subsequent retelling adds detail, increases scale, and removes doubt. UFOs are added not because there is evidence for them, but because they make the story more compelling. the population grows, not because more people actually vanished, but because a larger number is more dramatic. And yet, and this matters, the question of what Joe Labelle actually found in November 1930 has never been definitively answered. The RCMP's 1931 investigation concluded the story was likely fabricated by Kelleher, but it did not prove that Labelle found nothing. It is possible, not likely, but possible, that Labelle genuinely found a small, recently abandoned Inuit camp and reported it accurately. It is possible that the abandonment had a perfectly ordinary explanation that was simply never followed up. There is one theory that deserves more serious attention than it usually receives. In the 1930s, and for decades afterward, the Canadian government engaged in practices of forced relocation of Inuit communities, moving families from their traditional territories to government-selected settlements, often with devastating consequences. If a small Inuit group near Angikuni Lake had been relocated, voluntarily or under pressure, the result might have looked to an outside trapper arriving weeks later, exactly like what Labelle described: a camp suddenly vacated, possessions left behind, no explanation visible. This theory does not require a hoax, a supernatural event, or a fabrication. It requires only the history that was actually happening to Indigenous people in Canada at that time. Let us be precise about what the evidence actually says. The original 1930 article: 25 people missing from 6 tents, 1 opened grave, 7 dead dogs, food on cold fires. The 1931 RCMP investigation: the story appears to be a fabrication. The photograph used was archival. Nobody in the region corroborated the account. The 1959 Edwards version: 30 people, same basic details, no sources. Every detail added after 1990, the UFOs, the mass graves, the lights, the thousands of missing people, has no evidentiary basis in any document, testimony, or record. The Anjikuni legend, in its popular form, is almost entirely fictional. What is genuinely mysterious about Angikuni Lake is not the paranormal layer. What is genuinely mysterious is the original kernel. Why did Joe Labelle report what he reported? Was he telling the truth about what he saw? And if a small Inuit community did vanish from the shores of that lake in 1930, what happened to them? The 25 actual human beings who are claimed to have been there, and why did no one ever find them or hear from them again? Those questions, the small and human ones, remain open. They are not as spectacular as alien abductions, but they are real, and real is harder to forget. The Anjikuni story is not unique in this. It follows a pattern that repeats across the history of paranormal legend-making. A real event, or a reported event, provides the seed. An author with a gift for drama and no responsibility to verification nurtures it. A culture hungry for mystery accepts it. The flying saucers are added because they are exciting. The thousands of missing people are added because scale makes a better story. And eventually, the legend replaces the event so completely that even the skeptics are arguing about the wrong thing. That is the truth of Angikuni Lake, as best as it can be reconstructed nearly a century later. There was a newspaper article in 1930 written by a journalist known for dramatization, accompanied by a photograph that was not what it claimed to be. There was an official investigation in 1931 that found no corroboration. There was a 28-year silence. And then there was a radio broadcaster with a typewriter and no obligation to the facts, who gave the story to a generation that wanted to believe. The legend of Anjikuni is, in the end, a story about stories, about how they are made, how they grow, and how far they can travel from the truth that supposedly started them. Angikuni Lake is still there. It is still remote. It is still beautiful. The Inuit people who have lived in this region for thousands of years still know these lands far better than any trapper or journalist or paranormal author ever did. Whatever small, quiet, human event may or may not have occurred near its shores in the autumn of 1930 is buried now under nearly a century of invention, amplification, and outright fiction. We will probably never know what actually happened. That ambiguity, the real kind, is harder to live with than the legend, but it is what honest investigation leaves you with. The headline on Emmett Kelleher's 1930 article reads, "Vanished Eskimo Tribe Gives North Mystery Stranger Than Fiction." He meant it as a boast, stranger than fiction, because this is real. But it turns out he had it right for exactly the wrong reason. The story of Angikuni Lake is stranger than fiction in the way that all myths are, because the things people believe, the things they need to believe, are always more elaborate, more dramatic, and more comforting than whatever actually happened in the cold and the dark. The 25 people who may or may not have vanished from 6 tents near a frozen lake in 1930 deserve better than what the legend gave them. They deserve the truth. And the truth is, we do not know what happened to them. We may never know. That is enough. That is, in the end, plenty strange. This mystery is still open at its smallest, most honest level. And at Mistyonyx USA, we follow the evidence wherever it leads. If this investigation got under your skin, subscribe, like, and drop your theory in the comments. What do you think really happened at Angikuni Lake? We'll see you in the next mystery.